business. Minister.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. Thank you, colleagues, for your contributions. Mr Acting Deputy President, the purpose of this bill is to further modernise Australia's copyright laws. The bill will ensure that website blocking remains an effective means for copyright owners to address large-scale copyright infringement by overseas operators. Together with small business tax relief and location incentives, these changes will help our creative industries to produce Australian content and tell Australian stories. They also support investments that have made it possible for Australians to enjoy their favourite films, TV shows and music where and when they want. I'd like to thank all the stakeholders who were consulted on the exposure draft of this bill and also those who participated in the Senate Environment and Communications Legislation Committee's inquiry into the bill. The government did carefully consider the comments and matters from stakeholders and made numerous adjustments to the bill prior to its introduction into the other place. Some expressed concern about the cost and difficulty of establishing that an infringing website is located overseas. In a global internet environment, proving that an online location is physically located outside of Australia is a very high threshold, given the use of proxy servers and other devices to mask locations. To address this concern, the bill includes an evidential presumption that an online location is outside Australia unless proven otherwise. There was also a concern expressed that copyright owners could dictate the blocking of an open-ended list of URLs, domain names or IP addresses without agreement of carriage service providers or online search engine providers. This is not the government's intention with this bill, and a provision was included, subsection 11A2B, that confirms the Federal Court may grant an injunction that allows the blocking of future domain names, URLs and IP addresses on the condition that there is written agreement between the parties. This is consistent with orders that have been made by the Court to date, which explicitly provide for certain steps to be agreed in writing between the parties. As noted, the Senate Committee inquiry report, the measures are appropriately circumscribed, with the Court maintaining ultimate oversight over these types of injunctions, including the requirement that there be evidence of a sufficient nexus between the online location covered by the original injunction and the location to which the order is expanded. Some stakeholders suggested that online search engine provider should be defined. Doing so would be problematic and would risk locking into legislation a definition that was rendered redundant by the fast-moving changes underway in the technology sector. Instead, the bill has been amended to provide the Minister with a power to exclude certain online search engine providers from the website blocking provisions. The Senate Scrutiny of Bills Committee queried the justification for this power, noting that significant matters, such as the specification of providers that are to be exempted from an injunctive scheme, should be included in primary legislation. As noted in the government response to the Senate Scrutiny of Bills Committee, there is adequate justification for this power. This measure provides a more flexible way of dealing with the potential, although small, that an injunction is brought against a party to which these provisions were not intended to apply. Although this power is unlikely to be used, it provides an important safeguard to discourage overreach by copyright owners. The extension of the scheme to include online search engine providers is an important measure that will improve the effectiveness of the scheme. As noted in the Senate Committee inquiry report, a measure of this type is appropriate given that these providers play a significant role in both the infringement and enforcement of copyright. They are part of the problem as well as the solution. Some also expressed concern about the primary purpose or primary effect test, that it would enable sites such as Pinterest and Google Translate to be captured by a copyright blocking injunction. This is highly unlikely to occur, particularly as the Court may consider, under subsection 115A5, a number of factors when determining whether to grant an injunction, including proportionality and public interest. It's difficult to imagine that legitimate websites with other purposes or effects, such as social media websites and translation websites, would satisfy this test. Nonetheless, the bill was adjusted to include a cross-reference to subsection 115A5 to make clear that this is relevant to the Federal Court's considerations in determining whether to grant injunctions. The Senate Committee Inquiry report also concluded that there are adequate safeguards in section 115A, including as amended, to ensure that unintended consequences, such as extending to legitimate sites, would not occur in practice. There were also a range of concerns raised that did not warrant amendments to the bill. Some stakeholders argued that wording changes in subsection 115A1 from reasonable steps to such steps the Court considers reasonable to disable access would lead to the Court ordering inappropriate steps. This change, which is intended to clarify that the Court has the discretion to set the terms of the reasonable steps, is merely reflective of how the Court has applied the test to date. In effect, the revisions will continue to operate as they currently do in practice. Some were concerned that the primary effect test would increase the risk of carriage service providers being liable for costs and proceedings. Some also asked for subsection 115A9 to be amended to provide that carriage service providers are not liable for costs, even if they take part in proceedings. This is not an amendment that the government supports. The Federal Court is best placed to decide on the issues such as the awarding of costs, and it would not be appropriate to override or fetter this discretion. Some argued that copyright infringements are being effectively dealt with through voluntary actions to block and reduce access to infringing sites, and that injunctions are therefore unnecessary. The government welcomes efforts by some players, including Google, to voluntarily curb access to copyright infringing sites. This is a positive development and is entirely consistent with the government's overall approach to copyright. However, voluntary measures are just that, they're voluntary. The website blocking scheme simply provides a fallback if voluntary measures prove to be insufficient or are not implemented broadly across the industry. As noted earlier, the Senate Committee Inquiry considered submissions from a broad range of copyright owners, carriage service providers, digital platforms and digital rights groups. The committee concluded that, on balance, the benefits of the bill outweigh any potential negative impacts that could arise. The committee also recommended that the government review the effectiveness of the measures contained in the bill 2 years after its enactment. This is a sensible proposition and one that the government supports. A review of the operation of the copyright website blocking scheme will be conducted within 2 years of the commencement of the bill, and the findings and recommendations of that review will be made public. This bill is an important reform to Australia's copyright framework that will ensure that the Australian creative sector can continue to invest in quality content and stories. Can I, Mr Acting Deputy President, thank colleagues across the chamber for their support for this legislation. Can I particularly acknowledge the positive and constructive approach that Mr Mark Dreyfus, the Shadow Attorney General, has taken in relation to this matter, and I do want to acknowledge that in copyright matters in general, Mr Dreyfus has been a good colleague to work with. Can I also acknowledge Senator Griff and his positive contribution on behalf of Senator Lyons, and also Senator Hanson-Young, who has also been very supportive of sensible changes to copyright legislation, particularly this piece of legislation before us. Before I commend the bill to colleagues, I do note that Senator Hanson-Young was on the speakers list, was not in a position, I believe, to make a contribution at the time I got the call for the summing up. Mr Acting Deputy President, assuming she wishes to make a contribution in the hands of the chamber as to whether that is possible after the Minister has spoken, or whether that is best made in the committee stage.
Well, we could allow Senator Hanson-Young to speak now, and then you move the second reading at the conclusion, if that suits you.
In the hands of the chamber as to what is possible.